everyone. It's Tiffany with TJ Marie Consulting, bringing you another, what will be a really great conversation with my dear friend, Shelby Auler-Edge. We are going to be talking about women in philanthropy, and we're going to be discussing some recent big gifts from women in philanthropy and thinking about how we envision the sector being 10, 20 years from now in terms of how we can better position nonprofit organizations to engage in important conversations with women and giving, and how we anticipate the sector might look 10 or 20 years from now. So without further ado, this is another Breakfast at Tiffany's with Shelby, and I would just like to introduce my good friend Shelby. So Shelby and I have been friends for many years, and she is one of my favorite people in fundraising, and we talk often about our work with nonprofit organizations. We talk often about what's going well and some of the changes that we'd like to see happen. And so I'm incredibly grateful and honored that Shelby has decided to join me this morning to talk about what is really kind of our favorite subject, and that's talking about women and talking about the social climate and how we can be arbiters of change in our work. So without further ado, Shelby, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me. I love the name Breakfast at Tiffany. So clever. I was just thinking about it today, too, when I was counting back how long I've known you for. And I was like, 7 years. I can't believe I've known you for 7 years now, too. I can't believe it's been that long. And how much you've accomplished during that time, too. It's amazing to see. And I'm glad that you allowed me to witness you on this journey.
I never act in silo, Shelby. It is really only because of the really amazing relationships and support that I've had in over the years that TJ Marie is where it is today. So thank you so much for that. And obviously, you were one of my first little chickens. For those of you all who don't know, I call everybody a little chicken, and Shelby was one of my first little chickens 7 years ago, and she remains so today. So let's get started on this in this conversation, Shelby. So before I get started, though, I just want to say Shelby and I tried to have this conversation 2 weeks ago, and just like a good friend, when you try to, have a serious conversation and you haven't talked in a while, there's so much that you want to talk about. So we had an entire 1 hour conversation during the record time that we never recorded because we were just talking about life in general. So this is our second go at this. So hopefully it's a good one and a chance for us to have some good conversation. So let's get started, Shelby. It's going to be very conversational. I'm going to ask you some questions, and we're just going to dialogue about this topic. So one, I'll just ask you, a little bit about your journey in fundraising and how did you get involved in fundraising and philanthropy? If you listen to some of the other conversations I've had, most people who end up in fundraising, they end up in fundraising by happenstance. They didn't major in nonprofit, management or anything like that. So tell me a little bit about your journey to fundraising.
Yeah, so my journey in fundraising started when I was actually a college student at Indiana University, and there we had the Indiana University Dance Marathon, which a lot of schools do now, which is to raise money for the local children's hospital. So that was really kind of my taste into philanthropy. I always kind of knew that I wanted to do something to better the lives of others. So my initial thought, I remember in 5th grade, we had to write our last will and testament, which is kind of morbid to think about it now. And kind of where, your obituary and, where you would be. And mine said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I know that I'll end up in politics, which is hysterical because a decade later, I was studying politics at Indiana University. And my goal really was to, oh gosh, the way to go into philanthropy, you might need to edit that out. My introduction into philanthropy, I decided one of the things I wanted to do was really bridge the gap where philanthropy started and the government funding ended. So how could we bridge that gap and kind of help solve human suffering? And I felt like politics wasn't really the way to do that, and the philanthropy field was. And so that was kind of what kind of drew me in more, was being able to see change and not have to go through so many different systems to get there, and be able to see actionable change in a matter of time. So that was really kind of what led me into this journey. And then I graduated college and started straight into the nonprofit consulting field, which is where I've been since.
Awesome. And then Shelby, you talked about, this area where government funding ends and kind of like philanthropy begins. MLK has a quote that, essentially says that, philanthropy is great, but what we really should be focused on is making sure that we shore up the systems that make philanthropy even necessary, right? So it sounds like, you see that systems, need to improve, and then you see philanthropy as a way to shore that up. But obviously, you keep an eye toward making sure that you're enacting changes in ways that will have a long-lasting impact, right? Like I often say, philanthropy is what I do now, but I hope that there becomes a day where philanthropy ceases to be necessary.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So Shelby, let's talk a little bit about what that means in terms of women in philanthropy. So you and I are always kind of on the chat talking about these big major gifts that are coming through, that one are being made by women, and then two are having significant impact in organizations that really kind of focus their work on women. Tell me a little bit about why you think that first part, women making philanthropic gifts. Why do you think that's so important to see and to witness right now?
I think that historically women have always made these large gifts, but it's just been in the man's name. So I think that we have seen this generosity in the past, but the challenge is, and something that we've seen, decades ago too, was, a widow would start a foundation in her late husband's name, and then all the giving would come through that foundation, but really there was a woman behind that foundation. So there are, so many examples of that. And think of the amount of times that you and I have been on a major gift solicitation where it's just been the husband and he says, I got to talk to the boss about this. So I think that the women really have always been behind philanthropy, and it's super important now that we're seeing that are names that are attached to it, so that way it encourages more women to give. I think that now women are in this process of becoming more educated, becoming wealthier, and are much more likely to give larger gifts based off of the impact that they see from these gifts. And it's super, super important to see people like Mackenzie Scott and Melinda French Gates out there with their names rather than Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. This is what they're doing. What can we do to shine that light on women and what they're doing to make that impact that is seen across the globe, really, for a lot of the gifts that they're giving? So I think that women have always been behind it. It's now that they're just showing that they have the recognition behind it with giving in their own name rather than giving in their husband's name.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shelby is so right. University of Indiana publishes, their Women in Philanthropy report, and it talks about how influential women are in making these philanthropy decisions, right? So we already know that, like you say, behind the scenes, women are making a lot of these giving decisions, right? But, they aren't getting the recognition. And I think, representation is so important, and we know how important representation is. So the fact that their names are being associated with enacting and making impact in the areas that they find are important. It's important for people to see. So totally agree with you there. Let's talk a little bit about then on the other side of that, why you think it's so important that organizations that kind of focus on women and girls get the type of funding that they need. I think you and I talk about, a report that came out and showed that of the billions of dollars that are allocated from foundations, less than 4% of them are targeted for organizations that target women and girls of color. And, the numbers in terms of, organizations that focus on women and girls and the impact of philanthropy of women and girls are is staggering, that disparity. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on it.
I think a lot of what we see in philanthropy in terms of leadership within an organization, in terms of giving, is really that unconscious bias. And I think that a lot of times what we see in terms of giving and giving to women and to girls, if you compare like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, I think they're two totally different organizations, but I think that they see Boy Scouts as leaders. They're building fires, they're doing these things, and they see Girl Scouts as selling cookies, which arguably is better in my opinion. I'll take frozen Thin Mints all day, every day. But I think that there's just this bias that we need to deconstruct from head to toe, inside of philanthropy, outside of philanthropy, in terms of giving and all of that. So I think it starts with that. And I hope that during, the next 10 or 20 years, as you've mentioned, kind of what we hope to see, I hope that we do see that there's more thought behind giving, there's more research behind giving, there's more action behind the words that we're saying to make that impact. So that's kind of how I see it going and what I hope happens in the future. And I think that we really, in order to get there, we really need to deconstruct this unconscious bias that we have inside of nonprofits, outside of nonprofits, inside of giving, the whole system.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shelby, I know you're doing such great work inside of philanthropy, regarding that. And, it really makes me think about the fact that, when more women make the giving decisions, we, have an eye toward organizations that might have a disproportionate impact on women and girls. So in your work in philanthropy, can you maybe tell me about a time when, you as a woman in this industry brought maybe a different perspective to the table, without naming the organization or where you were, but just your perspective as a woman, and obviously, we're not a monolith, so we don't all think the same, but I know you have been in situations where the leadership was all male, and I have too, and so the stories are endless, but tell me about, you being able to maybe bring a different perspective to the table, that could have greater impact, because, you're the only woman at the table, maybe.
Yeah, I can think of one time in particular that really stands out, and it was actually when we were approaching another woman for a gift. So I think in that sense, whenever you have a woman who understands kind of the emotions behind giving, not to say that we're emotional people, I'm not going to get started on that, but the emotional attachment to giving, which is something that's been proven in studies too, is our attachment to giving and to seeing change. So I think that just kind of that emotional side of things and kind of thinking through that way rather than the business side and the transactional side of things is helpful. So I can think of a time that it's clear as day to me, and I think I actually spoke to you about this after it happened, where I felt like I just wasn't being listened to at the same time, where I said, this is not going to work. We cannot do this to this woman. She's not going to go for it. It's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. It's just the way it is. And I felt like I really wasn't being listened to at the same time, which is another problem that we have, I think, in philanthropy is you're being listened to, but are you being heard? And I certainly wasn't being heard. And I ended up being right at the end of the day, of course, because I'm always right. But I could think of this time in particular where I just really had to deconstruct it. And I said, from what I know from this woman, which is very little, but understanding how she's given in the past and what she's done in the past and how much she's given and her approach to everything, this is just not going to work. We need to change our approach for this. We need to make sure that we're doing X, Y, and Z in order to get this gift. And, at the end of the day, we ended up actually losing her gift because they went the different direction. However, the happy ending is that a few months later we went back without some of those leadership members and secured that gift again. So that one really stands out for me because I think that was the first moment where I felt like I was really kind of being silenced. And at the end of the day, it ended up having a happy ending, even though it really wasn't great at the time. We had to wait several months to go back and get that. But I think that was one moment where it really kind of stood out and really kind of made me also think, like, I do have an opinion. I have a voice, and this is one of those situations where I wasn't being heard, and what can I do in the future to make sure that I am being heard?
And, I think that's such a great example, and it brings me to this idea about women in leadership in philanthropy and in nonprofits. And so, what we know is that 75% of nonprofits that women staff 75% of positions in nonprofits. So overwhelmingly, when we think about, who is turning the wheels at these places, it's largely women. But the more an organization brings in terms of their revenue, what we see is a widening gap in terms of the leadership, right? So organizations that are smaller tend to have women leaders, and then at a certain level, the organizations that are getting the big gifts, we see a lack of women in leadership there. And so it begs the question of why a lot of the philanthropy is going toward organizations that are essentially led by men and overwhelmingly white men, and a lot of organizations though serve underserved populations, right? So tell me what you think about that, and why you think that is, and what we can do as a sector to make sure that women are, like you say, not just speaking, right, but being listened to and being heard, and so that we can see some better numbers in terms of leadership. And it's not just philanthropy, obviously. There are many sectors that mirror this imbalance, right? A lot of women doing a lot of the work at in the lower levels, and then when we get to who's going to lead them, though, it's the men.
I think it goes back to that unconscious bias that I mentioned earlier, and the fact, as you mentioned, if you didn't mention it, I was going to mention it as well, is the white man, and the white straight man, and their leadership role. Look at all of our presidents, all white straight men. Just this past year, we got a little bit of color in there, and it's a woman as a vice president, but still not a leader. I think historically we're kind of trained to think as the white straight man as the leader. And that kind of goes again with deconstructing that, and changing that bias to really show and give everyone a seat at the table and show that everyone is capable of these roles. It's not just that white straight man. And I think it starts with that. In terms of those smaller nonprofits, I think I've noticed this too, and it's several different aspects of different sectors, is that you have a small nonprofit that really has a strong mission but doesn't have that funding behind it, that is being run by a woman because that's the role that she could get, yet she has so many great ideas, and there's so much potential there. So what can those bigger nonprofits do that are run by those white men, and the people of leadership? What can they do to kind of help these smaller nonprofits? I think that there is a way for the nonprofit sector in general to help each other out and to really lean on one another. I understand that there may be too many cooks in the kitchen. I was in one of my MBA classes, and I actually raised my hand because I was like, this makes no sense why there are 4 different nonprofits working for the Everglades right now. They're all doing the same thing. They're all run by white men. And it's because they each want their opinion to be heard, and they want to be running it. Yeah. But imagine what you can do if you combine your resources together, and if you work together to solve these problems. So you all have the same end goal. What can we do to lift each other up to make sure that we're reaching that goal? So whether it's poverty that you're facing, or social justice, or the Everglades, what can we do to really make sure that we're working together, and how can we deconstruct that bias and make sure that the end goal is being achieved one way or another?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great point, Shelby, because more and more we're hearing from foundations and corporate donors that they want to see who nonprofits are partnering with, right? So, there are millions of nonprofits in the United States. And so when people have ideas, they say, I want to start a nonprofit because I have this idea. And I always say, look at who else is doing what you're thinking about doing in your area, right? Because, there is strength in numbers. So if you can get in and volunteer, or get in and see if you can be a part of that organization that already exists, then you're not necessarily competing for the same dollar. Which brings me to another point that you raised. There are more and more nonprofits think of their communities and other nonprofits in their communities as being competition. Right. So we don't want to associate with that nonprofit organization because, we want to keep all our donors and we don't want to share. But if the ultimate goal is to have impact and to live out a mission and to create change, and to provide services and resources, then it really shouldn't matter, in terms of, whether or not a donor gives to, organization A and organization B, or even that fear factor, right? There's some really great ways to partner with other organizations as a nonprofit leader, where the impact can really be, doubled and tripled when people kind of hold hands and attack a mission together. And we see that all across our sector and others as well. So thank you so much for bringing that out. You also mentioned about, this power dynamic and the trust factor, right? That people trust their money, with men more so than they do with women. And, part of this is, making sure that leadership in terms of board members, I think, that the board is diverse. Right. So I was talking about an organization a couple of weeks ago, and it was so interesting because they needed a new board member, and 99% of the existing board was white. And so, of course, if you ask those people, who they think should also be a part of the board, if nobody is bringing up and being intentional about diversity, or all men, and nobody's being intentional about bringing women's voices into the fold, then of course they're going to say, oh, my friend, it will be a good board member, and then your friend fits the mold that's already been created, right? Exactly. So it's incredibly important that people are willing to give up some of that power that really is, a part of what we need to see in the sector. So totally agree with you there. Let's talk a little bit about, some of the big challenges that you see in our industry, right? So we talked a little bit about why it's so important to see women making these big gifts associated with their name, why it's so important that women and girl focused organizations, receive good funding and receive operational support. What other big challenges do you see, in the industry that other nonprofit leaders who might watch this, might want to be aware of?
I think that another part, which we've mentioned already, is the leadership role, and not just checking a box. So I think going back to your point again about the board members, it may be that we want to get a person of color on here and just choose anyone just so we can check that box. Yeah. We've got our one person, 10%, 1 of 10, 10% diverse just to check a box. So I think that it really needs to be intentional. There needs to be intentional change behind it rather than checking a box. I think that that's what's really going to make the difference, because what you'll see is that whenever you're choosing that right person to fill that role, there will be great success that comes from that, and that's what will breed the change that we want to see. So we'll breed the success and the change that we want to see. So I think that there needs to be an intentional step to include people, and there needs to be an intentional thought process behind it. I can't say the word intentional enough. I think that that's the most important thing that needs to happen, rather than, again, just checking that box just to say we did it, because you can fill a role with anyone, and then if that person fails, then they'll say, see, look, we tried to hire a woman, she failed. So we really need to be intentional about the steps moving forward, and hiring the right people to bring into your organization, or doing the correct research for organizations that those major gifts should go to support. I think that that's the most important thing that needs to happen. And so also one of the challenges, too, again, is to make sure that it's happening the correct way rather than just doing it just to go through the steps.
Absolutely. And Shelby, oh my God, you said something that I think is so important, because I was on a panel once, and, I said something that's probably controversial, but I don't care. And I said, I really think that you all think that we should just be honored to be amongst you sometimes. And so I think about that dynamic too when it comes to, inviting women into leadership roles. Like women should just be happy to be amongst, the ranks. And so what happens when you create the dynamic is that women often don't feel empowered to bring their voices, right? They are, the mold has been created. You've been invited to come in and be a part of what's already established, and your thoughts and your opinions aren't welcome. You know what I mean? Like, you get in here and do what we've already laid out and established. Or part of, it's not just bringing people in, like you say, to check the box, but what are we willing to change, and what are we willing to listen and engage and be open to change, even if that means entering into what it could be considered uncomfortable territory, right? And so, because you would, essentially bring somebody in who can't be successful because they can't bring their whole selves, into a situation. So I totally agree. I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's not just about checking the box. It's about being willing to engage in meaningful ways to make sure that organizations have different perspectives, not just the same perspective all the time. So totally agree with you there. All right. So what is, Shelby, one thing that you would tell an aspiring fundraiser to help them prepare for a career in fundraising? What would you tell?
I think I'd tell them
17-year-old Shelby.
Yeah. I think I'd tell her to, I think the most important thing is to shadow someone. So if you have that opportunity, if you're interested in the nonprofit sector, shadow someone. I shared I think it was like a meme or something like that on LinkedIn not too long ago. And it was like what my family thinks I do, what my donors think I do, that thing. And it's so funny because I think that nonprofit world, you think that you're going to get out there and you're going to be out in the fields and you're going to be saving the world. And really so much of it comes down to mailings. So I would say shadow someone and see kind of what sector you're interested in, what field you're interested in, if you want to do consulting, if you want to work as a major gifts officer, just because there's so many options within the nonprofit field as well. And we're seeing that grow too, right? I mean, during the pandemic, so many things changed. Now there's a huge emphasis on communications and marketing and all of that. Online giving, everything that was so important during the pandemic whenever you couldn't really have your major gift officers going out in person. So I would say, the field is certainly growing. And, we see this through the giving as well. There's more and more dollars going to different organizations every year. Large donations are going to these organizations. So shadow someone, see kind of what role you want to take in the nonprofit field, and go for it. I think that it can't hurt to make connections. If I was 17 again, or looking back, I think I would have made some more connections. I would have been better about making connections and keeping connections, just to have a more diverse network. Because so much of my network is, from our organization and then from college. So I think I would have been better about making my connections. So I would say definitely, look into your connections, shadow someone, and get a feel for what the nonprofit world is like. Because it's not like what you see in the movies. However, there still is great potential for impact. And I would say that that's what's most important to me. It's kind of like looking at what I've done in the past, how much I've raised, what I've been a part of, and that kind of is what keeps me going.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Shelby. So another question that I have, and this is a personal question. You and I get personal though. Shelby, what are your personal philanthropic affinities? What is it that gets Shelby going in terms of where you like to invest, or where you like to, put your resources, your time, your talent, your treasure outside of what might be a client at the moment for you?
Yeah, so I think mine's very situational, which I think is something that also is pretty spot on with the IU Lilly School of Philanthropy, kind of like what's happening in the moment. Yeah. So last year it was certainly social justice movement, HBCUs. That was a primary focus of mine. I became a monthly donor to the NAACP. I was also a political donor to the last presidential election because that was super important to me. And then now, as we're kind of in this year, those are still important to me. But I'm also looking at, right now the CDC is changing their guidelines for rescue animals to be able to be brought back into the United States. So right now my focus is, kind of on saving those animals that are at the meat markets and things like that, and what we can do to get donations to them to bring them to the United States. So it's very situational and kind of what's happening at the moment. However, I try to pay attention as best I can to all nonprofits. So, as we mentioned earlier, the gender inequality and Melinda French Gates and the work that she's been doing, that's super important to me. I personally don't have $2.1 billion to give to that. I hope I get there one day,
Everybody's a philanthropist. Everybody's a philanthropist. If you give $1, you're a philanthropist. Yeah. If you give $1 billion, you're a philanthropist.
Yeah. So I find that it's important for me to stay on top of what other people are doing that I wish that I could do that I certainly can't. So I certainly support in those smaller ways, but I find that that's super important as well to kind of just stay in the know. Gender inequality, of course, is something that's important to both of us. And the work that they've been doing, the work that's been done throughout the last decade really, and beyond is something that is should certainly be at the forefront of conversation. So I would say that I'm very situational giving personally for my own giving. However, I certainly do live vicariously through the billionaires out there who are giving their wealth away, and I try to follow, what it is that they're supporting.
Absolutely. So Shelby, one of the things that you and I talk about a lot, of course, is, how philanthropy, creates change and makes impact in these situational environments. And one of the things that it's always shared in the research is that women tend to be, donors who give to a number of different organizations. So our affinities are vast, right? So you give smaller amounts to more organizations versus it's like, a focus on kind of like one singular, impactful, sector. And so what you just shared is, exactly what the research shows. We want to do all of it, and as much as we can in all of it. Yeah. And you and I certainly have an affinity for animals. Shelby and I both have dogs, and they are cousins, and we probably love each other's dogs more than we love each other. So, I hope Ricky is doing well.
Yeah, they were so just celebrated her birthday.
Yes. All right. So, Shelby, do you have any parting thoughts for us that you want to just make sure that, our audience knows in terms of, women in philanthropy, or any particular, thing you think people should be, focused on right now that you would like to elevate before we disconnect?
I think I'd close with the fact that I think that equality and equity are on the horizon. I think that the opportunities for women are there. And I think that, if we can deconstruct that bias, we can get more women to have a voice and to share their voice. So if you're watching this, I hope that you will share your voice. Yeah. And I think that will be kind of where we see the mountain start to move. So I that's something that I hope happens in the near future rather than, 10 or 20 years from now. But I think it is on the horizon. I think that the Me Too movement, led with the social justice movement, led with the pandemic, everyone's starting to learn a little bit more about themselves. We've had way too much time to think in the last year. And I really hope that that's, something that we certainly see soon.
Absolutely. Well, Shelby, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You and I have been trying to make this happen for so long. I'm so glad that we were able to talk a little bit about women in philanthropy and how important it is to, make sure that philanthropic dollars go toward organizations that impact women and girls, and that women and girls are at the forefront of these of the nonprofit sector, because it's us that is making up the majority of these organizations, often with very little resources, and making a tremendous impact in spite of that. So thank you so much, Shelby, for joining, and you and I will talk about your fabulous trip once we disconnect here. Continue our hours-long conversation that happens.
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking. I was like, we're definitely going to carry on this conversation. We'll probably talk about more things that we wish we would have talked about during the recording too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and everybody, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and thank you so much for taking some time to listen to this conversation. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.